Let's turn back to Matthew here real quick, and this is gonna be brought out a little bit more. Matthew. So go back two books. You'll hit Mark, and then you'll hit Matthew. If you turn to the left in your Bible, Matthew 23 and verse 23 and 24 of 23. 23, and 24. This is a section where Jesus, to put it kind of, he just goes off on the Pharisees and the scribes. He just goes off and, woe to you. And he does it for quite a while. He's got a lot to say to them. But in 23 and 24, somebody read that for us. 23 verses 23 and 24. Jesus kind of begins to hit that on the head in some of the other sections, and it's also going to come out in Luke as well. That some of these people were focusing so much on the things that they did, these laws, that they lost sight of what those things pointed to, whether they were issued by God, or in this case, the Pharisees placed some of those in effect, but that what stood behind the law in the Old Testament and what stands behind what Jesus is talking about is love, is God's love, His mercy, His compassion, and His faithfulness. Jesus reminded them of that in Luke 23, and He's hitting on it here in 6. That I think as human beings, we tend to just lose sight oftentimes of what's important and focus on things that we can do. We lose sight of the relationship and focus upon the rules and the regulations. And there were all sorts of good things. Jesus says that in Matthew 23, just read, you were giving a tenth of what you had. And they were supposed to do that. He said, but you needed to focus on what was at the heart of that, the mercy, the justice, the compassion, the love. That you could do all those other things, but they're really not worth a whole lot if you don't have the heart behind it. That if you don't have that mercy, that compassion, that love behind it, they're just not worth anything. Jesus called them whitewashed tombs. You look good on the outside, it's not so good on the inside. This is the problem that Jesus has with the Pharisees, that it continues throughout all the Gospels, that they were good at keeping the outward laws, but had no heart for God. That their heart inwardly wasn't oriented to God, and it certainly wasn't oriented to other people. Now, growing up in the church, I fell into this trap because it's much easier to follow rules than it is to keep up a relationship. You ever noticed that? It's easier just to do something than it is to work hard at keeping up a relationship, especially with God in this case. The Pharisees had that problem. I think we as a people often have that problem. And I think that I fell into this problem as a kid who grew up in the church. In the church, I grew up in a pretty strict conservative church, same as Wesleyan essentially. And as a teenager, all I saw, and I'm not blaming other people for this. It was just my own fault as much as it was anybody else's. But that for me, faith in Christianity, following Christ, solely revolved around the things I did do or the things I didn't do. Okay, so if I went to church when the doors were open, if I participated in youth group, if I was, did some leadership things, if I gave some of my money, if I said my prayers, if I read my Bible, if I didn't drink, if I didn't smoke and I didn't chew, and if I stayed away from girls who did, that was faith. That's what it was. All those outward things that I was pretty good at, or at least other people thought I was pretty good at. But it wasn't for several years later, till I was well into college, that the light bulb finally went on and I realized that wasn't faith at all. That I really wasn't fooling anybody, not myself. I certainly wasn't fooling God, maybe fooling some people at church. But that really didn't have anything to do with faith. I kind of got the cart before the horse. That I knew nothing of the weightier matters of the law that Jesus talked about love for God and for others, about mercy, about compassion for other people. And it wasn't until I figured out that God showed those things to me and changed me that I was supposed to turn around and show those to other people. So that gets to the heart of faith. And I think that's what Jesus reminds us of here, is that there's all sorts of good things out there. There's all sorts of good laws out there, and they're often there for a reason. In this section, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not so good, sometimes they're instituted by God, sometimes they're not. If they are instituted by God, they're there for a reason. But don't get those before the relationship. You know, that relationship always comes first. Relationship with God comes before following His rules. If we're just following rules, it doesn't really do a whole lot. But if we have that relationship with God, that love, that mercy, that compassion, that's when everything begins to fall into place. You know, mercy and compassion require two things. They require that we have realized that God has shown them to us. And they also require unselfishness, at least to a certain point. And I don't want to pretend that we can be 100% totally unselfish. That would be really difficult to do. I think Christ can help us get there, but it's hard. But it requires us showing this mercy and compassion. What Jesus does here, it's not always fun. You know, life is messy. You know, it's messy wading into other people's issues, and Jesus does that. He does it here. He does it, the man with the withered hand. How many of you have helped out somebody else that it's just been a really messy problem? Oh, I have. You know, it's easier, and I don't want to, now when I say this, these are good things. But so I don't want to come across as downgrading these things, because it's what we need. It's part of the Christian life. But it's much easier to focus on my personal spirituality. You know, it's easy to make sure I'm doing my devotions. It's easy to make sure that I'm saying my prayers and to listen, you know, to the Christian radio station and to make sure I'm personally where I need to be with the Lord. And that's really important, because if we're not taking care of that, then we're in all sorts of trouble. But following Jesus branches beyond that. And I think that's part of what comes out here, is that we can focus, we need to focus, and we need to stay in touch with where we are personally, spiritually. But it can't stop there. It's got to branch out into the mercy and the compassion that Jesus shows for His disciples, that He shows for this man on the Sabbath, that He wanted the Pharisees to show to other people as what? As God had showed them, or should show them first. So, you know, I want us to think about here that don't let spirituality, don't let our Christianity, the things we should do or don't do, don't let that get in the way of mercy and compassion. You know, that's really where this section is going. Jesus being Lord of the Sabbath, don't let being a Christian, whatever that might mean for us, get in the way of showing love, mercy, and compassion to others. You know, and there are ways that we can let being a good Christian get in the way of showing mercy, love, and compassion to others. Anybody have any thoughts on how we might, or any ways we can fall into traps of letting our own Christianity fall or come in the way of showing mercy and love and compassion to other people? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Okay. Allowing judgment. Yeah. Yes. And I know that's, for me personally, that's a tough one. You know, I've done just enough work with, especially people with drug problems, that it's easy to say this isn't going to work. I've seen it too many times. I'm not going to invest any time or energy in this person because they're just going to go back to the way they were. That's a tough one. It's a tough one for me to to not judge situations and to judge people before I am willing to show them the mercy and compassion that Christ shows and shows me, shows us. Yeah, that's a good one, Julie.